Cobus van Staden. I'm the managing editor of the China Global South Project, or CGSP for short. We provide non-partisan and objective research and insights on China's evolving relationship with the developing world. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first ever CGSP China-Africa Energy Forum. We're turning the old boring webinar into something a little more dynamic and fun. So we are, at the moment, we're live on YouTube, LinkedIn, X, and on Facebook. And we're also broadcasting to regular listeners of our podcast on Spotify, Apple, and other platforms. So we'll have inputs coming from all over the world, and we plan to turn this into an ongoing discussion series, bringing you insights you can't get anywhere else. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest issues in China-Africa relations, electricity. So Africa has huge electricity demand. Almost half of Africans don't have access to stable supplies of electricity. Meanwhile, China is now the world's first electrostate. It produces around 80% of solar components around the world. So if you have solar energy, there's almost a very, very large chance that you have Chinese solar energy. And it is also a leader on most other electricity fields around the world. So today's Energy Forum launches CGSP's China-Africa Energy Tracker. This is an interactive map that provides the most comprehensive public data of China's involvement in Africa's energy sector. It gives you a unique view of the entirety of the African power landscape and what China's role is in there. And you'll see it's a very complicated role. So there's a link to this map. It's not behind a paywall on our site. We'll give you a link in the show notes, and so you can go and play around with that map. It's really fascinating. To help get you into what this data means, we also produced a framing paper by Frangton Chiyemura, a major voice in the Africa-China field and a lecturer in international development at the Open University in Milton Keynes in the UK. So Frangton will start us off today introducing the China-Africa Energy Tracker and his paper. We'll then move on to comments from two key experts. Wei Shen is a research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies and one of the leading global experts on China's involvement in African electrification. Ajikai Ajay is an expert on African energy finance and a CGSP research fellow focusing on Africa. She published an amazing series of articles for us unpacking the issues that face Africa's power sector, and we'll include links to those in the show notes as well. Before we start, please remember we are live and we would love your questions and comments. So please post questions and comments in the chat on YouTube, on LinkedIn, or tag at China GS Project on X. And we'll try and kind of like draw in these comments and respond to them live. So without any further ado, I'm handing over to Frangton. Please go ahead, Frangton.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are. Well, thanks a lot, Cobus, for the kind introduction. And it's also such a great honor to be joined by colleagues Wei and Ajekai on this very important topic that we hold dearly. So thanks. Yes, I wanted to reflect briefly on this report that looks at the role of China in Africa's energy sector. And this is coming from a report that was commissioned by the Global China Project. And it tries to really look at the role of China in different African countries, looking specifically at even the types of the sector or the different energy resources that the Chinese have been involved in. So what I wanted to start with maybe is to kind of give you kind of an overview, a broad overview in terms of strategic insights, if that's helpful. So the first thing really that we see from this report, which as Cobus has said is going to share with you, is that there is increasingly move towards what would refer to as strategic engagement from the Chinese towards the Africans, in which we see the Chinese investments are increasing towards Africa's energy sector. And based on the data that we used in the report, we can tell at least about 33 billion US dollars was actually invested in almost over 32 gigawatts power generation projects across 30 African countries. What this really tells us specifically is that China is now an indispensable player in Africa's energy sector. And then the second aspect that I also want to highlight, which is also covered widely in the report, is this focus on renewable energy. So, of the about 84 projects that we identified in the report, I wanted to bring to your attention that majority of those projects are actually renewable energy. And that goes also with the kind of the regional focus of these projects within the 30 African countries that we looked at. So, for instance, the report shows that Southern Africa, in this case, has the highest number of Chinese projects that were commissioned at least between 2020 and 2024. What's interesting specifically about this renewable energy focus, we see that hydropower still remains the dominant energy source for which the Chinese are actively engaged in Africa. And this is followed by by solar and other renewable energy portfolios in Africa. What this really shows us is that the way the Chinese are engaging in Africa's energy sector responds much to Africa's energy needs, which kind of shifts the paradigm from other, if you want, traditional development players, where the focus has been what is the interest of this investment or partner or in this donor or these agents, which then tries to push those interests into respective African countries. This is a little bit interesting in this case because for China, it's always responding to African countries' needs, particularly in the energy sector. And then another aspect that is covered as well in the report is the investment models and the implementation modalities of these projects. So what we see, for instance, is that China is increasingly getting sophisticated, particularly around the financing mechanisms or the financing structures of these projects. So from one end, we can see that China is developing projects that are not funded by Chinese funders or projects that do not have Chinese funding. And on the other hand, we are seeing that the Chinese are also developing projects that also are funded by Chinese funding sources. And thirdly, we are seeing that the Chinese as well, what they are doing, they are supplying technology to some of these projects which are not even funded by Chinese sources. So what this means really, it's demonstrating the flexibility of Chinese entities, especially in the energy sector, as they can easily adapt different financing and implementation modalities. But what's key, and I want to emphasize this point here, is that at least as per the report, we see that there is an kind of a correlation between countries that tend to have more natural resources with Chinese energy funding or energy projects in Africa. So, for instance, in the report, you would see that there is much concentration of Chinese projects in Southern Africa, and this is coming from Zimbabwe and Angola, to be precise, which tend to be very rich in natural resources. So we can begin to draw some conclusions here that indeed there is a strong natural resource infrastructure connection in these investment decisions. And then finally, one thing that I would like to bring to your attention as well is that although China is now an indispensable player in Africa's energy sector, there are challenges like in any other cooperation, really. And of course, these challenges really requires African countries to be proactive, particularly in ensuring that the projects align with national development priorities. I'll end here and then I'll come back in the next phase, Kobus.
Thank you, Frangton. Achikai, I was wondering, kind of how this research and these reports kind of made you think about this issue of how Africa finances its electricity transition. So, yeah, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much, Kobus. And I think I'll start off with the formalities just to say thank you for having me. It's really such a pleasure to be here at CGSP's inaugural Energy Forum. And also just a huge congratulations to your team for putting this together. Also such a pleasure to share the stage with such brilliant minds. So I really love your question around how has this tracker and, the report that's been produced really made me think about Chinese investment in Africa's energy sector. I'll start with just a quick backstory to set the scene. So when I initially started the PhD and I submitted the proposal in that first year, it received really good reviews that, just highlighted how important and timely the topic was. But the examiners really added a clear warning, which was that I might not be able to finish because the necessary data that wasn't available that would allow me to essentially conduct rigorous and in-depth research. And they weren't entirely wrong. I just had to set up, really on a quest to find this data, traveling from east to west to southern Africa, visiting, Boston University, meeting up with Wei Shen in Beijing. And that's actually even how I got in contact with CGSP. So really looking for this data took me on a search around the world, basically. And even during that search, every African government official that I spoke to had really agreed to take part in the research and be interviewed, not because they had all the answers, but because they were seeking answers. They wanted to understand how these projects were essentially, Chinese-backed projects were essentially working in other African countries. So honestly, the appetite for reliable information on this topic is so unmistakable. And that's why tools like this energy tracker are so important to provide really clear, usable evidence for governments, researchers, developers, financiers, just to essentially put projects together in the most viable way possible. And I think I'll just focus on essentially the transparency and the data aspects on this. Really, I think the two key takeaways as I, worked with the tracker and from my experience in just conducting research in this field is I would say that the tracker turns visibility into negotiating power. So the simple thing is once you have clear facts, clear information, you can actually work and negotiate better. The tracker gives, as we can see, I don't know who's controlling it at the back there, but you can see it's a living map as to what's being built, who's doing the building, where is it, what technologies are there. It helps you spot clusters, it helps you pick up patterns, where's the solar, who's delivering. And I think all this information is so important to African governments and ministries to allow them to plan properly. It's important to developers to allow them to structure, bankable pipelines of projects. And it's also very important to financiers to have this kind of information to allow them to price risk. So essentially, I think, my big takeaway is like having information such as this allows people to really negotiate with a map and not a blindfold, and that alone pays off. I think my second point is it's really speaks to the same sort of issue around the flip side is the gaps that we generally find in the field, and it's really nice to see how this tracker essentially tries to plug those gaps around unclear financing terms, timelines, etc. So yeah, I think just really focusing on the data, tools like this, research papers like the ones Frangton have put together are so vital for providing information that generally isn't in the public for various reasons. And just collating it into such a space is really, it helps take discussions and projects forward. And I think that's critical in a continent that has such huge energy access gaps. So thank you. Handing back to you.
Thank you, Wei. One of the things that surprised me in looking at the data is the complexity of China's role. And how different Chinese actors show up on so many different levels. In this landscape. So I was wondering what you drew from the data.
Oh, thank you so much, Cobus, for inviting me to this such important event. And also a big congratulations for the CGSP colleagues for this database. I'm already a very zealous user. In the past 2 days, I think I'm at least spending 2 or 3 hours a day on this, checking the data, cross-checking the data with my paper and in Guinea and the DRC to see if there's anything wrong with my previous kind of data and so on. So this kind of a very important and very useful instruments for the researchers like me. I think most of the researchers in the field would agree with me that this is exactly what we need. filling a lot of gaps, as Jack already mentioned. And also big congratulations for Frank for this report, and also a very good analysis and also important insights generated from this report, which can serve as a basis for this discussion. And to answer the question about the diversity of the Chinese players and also the diversity of the projects, and I think we can talk about the actors probably at a later stage, but I think the biggest impression for me is the notable and decisive shift from the conventional fossil fuel investments to renewable energy projects, which shows several things. First is the unparalleled technical supremacy from the Chinese actors in the hydropower sector, particularly in the hydropower sector and solar panel sector, but also a kind of a diverse of project types, different energy sources from wind, geothermal, wave, and so on. This is absolutely exciting and different from what we observed only, I think, 5 or 10 years ago. And I think then that really drives the price down. I mean, if you look at the countries that are receiving these, hosting these projects, and it will be very amazing to see such variety types of investment are actually affordable and operationable in such a variety of countries, which many of them are low-income countries. So that's a really amazing change I observed. And also, it's like you can also see the announcement of President Xi in 2021 at UN Assembly to stop financing coal. Only 4 years ago, I think that such kind of a top-down announcement is really taking effect for the Chinese actors to really have a pivot towards renewables in the last few years. That's one observation. And the other, talking about complexity or diversity, is the shift from very large-scale projects to increasingly larger number of small projects. 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts, I think a significant, if not majority of the projects are under 50 megawatts now, right? So that shows that another kind of a political slogan of small and beautiful, small and smart is no longer a slogan. It's really taking effect on the ground. There are different, of course, drives behind it, and there's probably a risk concern in it, because the Chinese investors, increasing number of investors, are kind of shifting away from the traditional state utility, this type of lending, or try to stay away from the sovereign credit risks and so on. So they will focus more on decentralized system and a smaller in smaller scale. So that's another very interesting finding. And the third is that because of that, coming back to the diversity and complexity of the picture, in terms of financing, we probably have 2 parallel tracks. Even between hydro and solar, we see very conventional, this kind of EPC plus financing model provided by China Exim or China Development Bank. That still works for many hydro projects. But excitingly, again, is that for renewables, we have more innovative financial models that involve not just policy banks, but other Chinese or non-Chinese financial institutions, sometimes MDBs, sometimes even commercial banks, sometimes more innovative solutions like using green bond and so on. So these are really the exciting but more complex picture and the landscape where we are getting from this database. Yeah, I will stop here and then we can discuss other topics if you like. But that's a very exciting landscape we're talking about today.
Yeah, I also think so. Frangton, as you pointed out, China is emerging as a really unique partner, I think, in this field. And so, in this context, which kinds of opportunities and pitfalls do you think African decision makers should keep in mind?
Thanks, Kobus. I mean, again, I think it's all think about also the current moment that we are in. Of course, we understand this geopolitical competition, as everyone is talking about, and some scholars actually even considering it to be more of like the second Cold War, really. So I think it's really thinking about how then do African players make use of this opportunity. Of course, I mean, it has its own challenges, so to speak, but then how can African countries in this context make use of this to such that it leverages or it kind of contributes towards building more bargaining power in this interaction with these external development partners in Africa. So, of course, specifically looking at what the Chinese have been doing in Africa's energy sector over the period of the reports are covered here, I think there are few opportunities that I think can be possibly accelerated on. So the first one really is that China is still very much focused on infrastructure, hard infrastructure, so to speak. So that's a clear signal opportunity which African countries can really tap into. This is, of course, a bit unique in the sense that what we see from other traditional development partners for Africa, the focus has kind of shifted from hard infrastructure to soft infrastructure, so to speak. So indeed, there is an opportunity here which the Chinese can contribute to, particularly in the context of this huge energy gap for African countries. And then the second thing really that we have to focus on here is that the scale of this infrastructure focus from the Chinese is quite massive, right? Scale either in terms of project capacity or in terms of financial contributions or financial commitments. Similarly, with technological commitments as well coming from China to Africa, there is a massive particular which indeed African countries should proactively ensure that this moment is not lost, particularly in developing the so much needed energy resources in Africa. And then the third aspect that I want to bring to this discussion is the ability of Chinese entities to implement these projects at such pace. So as I said earlier on, I mean, if you to check in the report, you see that there are quite a number of projects which are not funded by the Chinese entities, but are developed by the Chinese entities. So in other words, the Chinese are increasingly seen as, the best contractors or the best constructors in terms of developing the energy projects in Africa. So if you check, for instance, from the report, we see that about 79 out of the 84 projects we looked at were actually built by the Chinese, right? And in the remainder, some of those projects are actually not financed by the Chinese, but still a project which is commissioned by a non-Chinese, or in this case, a Western or non-traditional or a traditional development partner. But then the contract is awarded to a Chinese company or a Chinese institution. So there is increased confidence, if I can put it that way, in the capabilities of Chinese construction companies in developing projects in Africa. So clearly, this is an opportunity that African countries really can tap into in developing their so much needed energy in Africa. And then maybe kind of rounding off in terms of the opportunities, there is this aspect of skills and technology transfer, and that also comes into play when we look at what the Chinese are doing. Of course, I mean, there are ongoing discussions around how much and to what extent indeed these skills really transferred to African, for instance, engineers or technical personnel who are involved in the project. But at least when we look on the ground, we can see that the Chinese are doing a lot, particularly in transferring the technology, in transferring the skills. And we can see this, for instance, in terms of labor or employment patterns in some of these projects that the Chinese are involved. We see a localization rate of about 80 to 90% in most of these projects, which seems to suggest that majority of the people actually working in these projects are African. Of course, I think as it goes without saying much is that some of these really are actually going to low skills or mid skills, and then there is kind of a higher concentration of Chinese in terms of the management and more technical positions in this project. And this is something really that I think some African countries really need to work on. Now, switching this to more of the pitfalls here, Cobus, I think, and this is something that is also documented in the report, that given the sheer volume of Chinese involvement in African countries, there is a possibility of deepening dependency, which basically means, for instance, in the case of Zambia, where we see about 11 projects totaling about 4 gigawatts actually being done by Chinese entities. Well, it's a good thing that at least the Chinese are involved, but it also has possibilities of risks in the future in case disagreements arise around how these projects are actually developed. And for instance, if you look at 4 gigawatts, that's a massive addition, right? A massive one. What happens if things go south with some of these entities that are involved? Would then not limit the policy autonomy of the Zambians in this case? What are the implications in terms of other sustainability discussions that everyone is talking about, particularly in the context of energy development? And I think some of more kind of general, and everyone speaks about risks really at the moment. Of course, this issue of environmental risks, issues of standards, and also issues, as I said earlier on, around the specificities of the tech which is transferred and the skills which are transferred to African countries. So these are broadly some of the things that African countries for now really have to kind of pay or focus on as China is increasingly deepening its cooperation with Africa in the energy sector.
Wei, how does that? How do you think about these issues, particularly on the kind of pitfall side? Like, how does this calculus look from the perspective of the Chinese side?
Let's start with the technology transfer, which is also my interests as well. I think the technology transfer is happening on the ground in different formats, in different forms that sometimes not really captured by even the scholars and practitioners and think tanks. And at the moment, I visited many projects on site. I see how the training programs are implemented by the Chinese companies, and I see the rising percentage of African employees in the project companies. But there are still challenges. For example, it is a little bit easier to train labor-intensive workers rather than managers and engineers and so on, which requires more sophisticated training programs, which sometimes is absent in the host countries. So we need this kind of underground trainings and so on implemented by the Chinese companies only because of the need for the project implementation, but we also need an education, more systematic education programs within the host countries, which means that large-scale investments need to be accompanied or need to be integrated better with aid programs provided by either by China or other bilateral or multilateral agencies. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any other specific aspects you would like to highlight, Cobus. Maybe you reminds me, apart from technology transfer, is there any particular aspects you would like to?
I think that the broader issue of dependency is one that that Frangton was also mentioning, and I was wondering what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. Zambia is a very unique case. It has a huge amount of mining investments that required some captive power solutions. That's one of the reasons I think you see more projects than other places. And also there are large hydropower potentials that can be tapped. So there are 1 or 2, I think, very large hydropower stations there in Zambia. So in general, it is wise for the host countries to put eggs in different baskets. And so but the question is that given China's kind of a technical supremacy and their deliverance supremacy, that they can do whichever projects you want to do at whatever lower cost you can imagine, and also at whatever tight time frame that these projects need to be done. So the competition for particularly for certain type of projects, and particularly for the construction projects, the so-called EPC projects, is more often among Chinese companies rather than between Chinese companies and other foreign companies. But things are getting better because we see some countries like Kenya, they do have domestic EPC companies that are developing very fast. So that is more or less like a pathway to diversify or to kind of de-risk from this over-concentration on Chinese construction companies. But again, it takes time, and it is more or less like a balancing view from the host government, is that you want a cheapest project in the shortest time, or you want to balance it with more kind of a strategic view that we can discuss later. But it's more or less like a balancing between price, time, and also the level of competitiveness in the market.
Yeah. Ajikai, as you see, one of our listeners posed a question raising this issue that Frangton was also mentioning, that the close link between mining activity and electrification. So in a lot of cases, like as we've seen in Zimbabwe, for example, some of these electricity projects are meant to drive mining and mineral refining. But then the question is also whether one could then, whether Africa is going to remain kind of like stuck in that kind of specific space, or whether you, and I'd like to ask your opinion about that, whether you see opportunities for broader based electrification, you kind of maybe hooked off of, or adjacent to these big industrial projects.
Thanks. That's an excellent question. I think, just looking at Africa's power landscape, one reason that I would say is really driving this electrification of industrial kind of, or like businesses mining, is just because of how utilities, well, not just because, but one of the key driving factors is that utilities in the region are generally not so financially sustainable and viable. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, I think we have 2 financially viable utilities who essentially buy the power and sell it to the public. And so as a risk mitigation measure, a lot of companies, and I see this is probably what's happening in the case where we see China funding a lot of mining activities, would be that companies are looking for the most financially viable model. And, funding mining activities, obviously because of the sale of the products, then makes the whole essentially the whole chain of business quite successful. So I think that's why the start of there's just a huge increase, or a focus has been on funding activities such as mining, because there is kind of a sustainable flow of finances to be able to pay for the development of the infrastructure. Essentially, they're a good client, for lack of a better word. And notwithstanding kind of the focus on these clients, I think nonetheless it has an impact on communities, right? So if we start with essentially funding mining operations, that would have an impact on the community more broadly, and would essentially, in a sense, drive economic development within that community. So as that mining town is becoming more financially viable, has, more buying power, I think there will be that ripple on effect. So, I mean, looking at it from a more optimistic view, as much as it's, the goal is to provide access, and we're seeing access to everybody, and we're seeing a focus on businesses and mining, for example. I think there will be the ripple on effect where through financing and through electrifying businesses, we have the opportunity to financially empower citizens, and then that would have a ripple on effect to essentially say citizens might now be at a place where they're able to better pay for electricity, and hopefully, management of our utilities gets better. And so we just see that ripple on effect. But even in the work that I do, like my day-to-day, a lot of the work that we look at is around financing productive use activities, essentially to catalyze economic viability and to, strengthen the economic economic strength of that community. So long story short, yes, there's a focus on mining, there's a focus on larger businesses for now. But I think that in the end, it's the hope that there would be the trickle-down effect, just making communities have more buying power. Yeah.
So we shared the reports and the tracker with a few experts in this field, and they sent us some questions. So the first one is from Mui Yang, who's a senior energy analyst at Ember Energy, a very influential climate-related research institution. So, I think, we're going to play the question. Ajika, I think maybe I'll pose it to you. But Wei and Frangton, please feel free to jump in if you'd like.
My name is Mu Yang from Amber, a global energy think tank. First, I would like to congratulate on the launch of this excellent special report on China-Africa energy engagement. It is very timely, substantive, and very practical. And the research presented in the report maps where momentum is building. And the report also identified the very familiar issues affecting the bankability of renewable projects in many developing markets, like policy uncertainty, regulatory gaps, technical and system constraints. And we all recognize unlocking large-scale finance, both domestic and international, depends on fixing this soft infrastructure side of the equation, not just deploying hardware. So within this context, my question has two parts. First, how can Chinese stakeholders help build institutions supporting Africa host countries to put in place credible policy framework, predictable regulation, standardized contract, so renewable projects get de-risked and scaled? Second, is there scope for North-South cooperation alongside China's role? Bring in multilateral banks, OECD partners, and standard setting bodies to accelerate this institution building process in Africa. And given the global North's strength in institutional design and standards, how can we leverage those capabilities to shorten the learning curve? Thank you, and I look forward to the panel's thought on these questions.
All right, thank you. Those are such lovely, very interesting questions, and I think they're very, in a sense, interlinked. So, but I'll start with the first one. So, how can China help build institutions? I think it's a very, very important question, and I think there was a researcher who reached out for an interview about a month ago, essentially looking at the same question. So, from the projects that we've done, so currently, we're implementing an EU-funded project. And with that project, what I've seen is that there's a package for actually project implementation. And then there's about 20% or more of that financing actually put aside for technical assistance and to building, institutional capacity. And from there, we're working with regulators essentially to get their licensing processes to be more streamlined streamlined. We're setting up IT platforms to make it easier for, for investors to come in. We're setting up kind of training sessions to sensitize the public around how tariffs work, what goes into the tariff, and just to allow people to understand. And so I would say that looking at, most of the Chinese-backed projects that I've seen, there hasn't been such a focus on the technical assistance aspect within implementing specific projects, right? So most of the projects I've seen, a lot of the funding just goes to, the EPC side of the project. So I think, combining or adopting a model where you not only build the infrastructure, but you also work with the different agencies to essentially strengthen their processes would be very important. And I think that, very nicely links to the other question about if there is that opportunity for North-South collaboration in terms of strengthening institutions. I definitely think that there is, just seeing how, the project that I spoke about earlier is being implemented. I think that there's room for collaboration from all three. So from the African host state perspective, one thing that we've really been focusing on is making sure that we carry the government along. So as we're working on, these IT platforms to streamline processes, one of the things that we've done is that we really focus, for example, in the electricity sector, because that's where the investment support, where the funding is going to. And we shared this with the government regulator, and they said, actually, we need our whole platform to be expanded to include our water regulation, for example. And that's not something we initially thought about, but it would feed directly into essentially some of the work we do if, we're developing hydro. So I think it's very important, one, to ensure that the government voices are heard and carried along, and not just because funding is being provided, it means that the funder calls the shots. And then from the Chinese perspective, I think what's very, very important in terms of, collaboration within, if we say the triad of Chinese participants, Western participants, and African governments, I think what's important for Western governments to maybe pick up is kind of that flexibility in financing that China offers, which is very important in, in the context of how African utilities and economies are set up, where they're not as stable and maybe a bit more risky. I think that flexibility, that relationship building is very important. So there's definitely that scope. And I would say that comparing and contrasting, for example, Western finance project to a Chinese finance project, there really is more scope for China to drill down on the technical assistance. Having said that, I think that what we are seeing from China is technical assistance at a country-to-country level and not so much at project level. And that is still very important. So I know that there was projects, I think, where we worked on this in a report we did previously, but there was a China, Zambia, South-South, project where there was a big focus on technical assistance. And then I think the same happened with Ghana, where China essentially, the Ministry of Science and Technology helped Ghana essentially draft its renewable energy master plan. So not to say that there isn't that technical assistance happening. I think maybe it's just not happening at a project level, more country to country, and that's where we can maybe strengthen. But thank you, opening up if there's any other contributions.
Yeah, Frangton, go ahead. You mentioned you'd like to add something.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Muyi, for that very interesting question. It seems like we are plugging ourselves here away. So we wrote a piece, I think in 2023, where we looked at the institutional actors involved in Africa's energy market, and we looked at the Chinese as well as the Africans in this context. So what we found in that piece was that there was an institutional vacuum from the Chinese side, particularly in engaging themselves in developing some kind of policy frameworks or institutional design of these energy or utility enterprises in Africa. And what was leading to that was there is a kind of a divide in terms of remits or focus areas between different Chinese institutions involved in Africa's energy sector. So we had, for instance, in that piece, what we refer to as the guardian ministries, which is more of different Chinese ministries with kind of the regulatory power in terms of approving projects in African countries. And then we also had the second layer, which was development financial institutions, which had the responsibility for approving financial risk management, etc. And then at the third layer, we had the kind of your project implementers, which are mainly state-owned and private-owned enterprises, focusing specifically on the energy aspect. But we saw there is kind of a divide between these three layers of institutions, because much of work on Chinese projects in Africa is actually undertaken by these state-owned or private-owned enterprises. And there's so much disconnect between what they are doing on the ground and the policy direction or institutional direction from the other institutional actors involved in that. So that's what I wanted to say, that which is quite different than when we compare with Western development partners. And we kind of make use of South Africa as an example, where during the development of the renewable energy procurement program back around 2008, 2009, we saw a number of Western development partners actually being involved in the design of that renewable energy procurement program before even projects were commissioned at that time, or before the bidding windows were commissioned at that time. So clearly we can see that there is a kind of a vacuum from the Chinese players around that, because much of the work really is done by the project implementers. And rarely do you see a Chinese Ministry of Finance, or rarely do you see the Chinese Export and Import Bank being involved in influencing policy direction for an African energy utility company or institution.
Thanks. Thank you. And you know, Frangton, I know you have to jump out now to make a different different appointment. So we just wanted to thank you so much for joining us today and for all of your amazing work on that report. So we will circulate that. We're going to stay with Wei and Ajikai slightly longer, but yeah, thank you so much, Frangton. So moving on, Wei, it's a very interesting question that came in from Ebipere Clark, who's a visiting fellow at the Africa Policy Research Institute in Berlin, focusing on this kind of like larger the tension between grid expansion and kind of consumer needs that Ajika was also kind of referring to earlier, and how both of those fit into the Belt and Road initiatives. So I'd love to get your response to that, and then Ajika, feel free to jump in as well.
Is on financial sector readiness, energy markets, and the global capital flows and geoeconomics that shape climate finance architecture. China's engagement in Africa is evolving from BRI-1's big infrastructure era to BRI-2's small is beautiful model, more commercial, more decentralized. However, this is happening in a post-COVID environment of tighter debt sustainability and questions around local energy market bankability. If the real challenge is energy access, should African governments, working with China, begin to treat energy products for citizens like rooftop solar as a complementary path to large state-to-state energy projects such as grid solar? Under this dual mandate approach, what would it take to make this consumer-led pathway financially and institutionally viable within the new BRI-2 logic? Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is a very timely and important questions, and people in China, many researchers in this field, and even some policy think tanks are discussing this, because we have notably surging exports of solar panels in the year, not just in Africa, I think in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. So it's really kind of a revolutionizing people's thinking about or imagining of energy pathways. in the global south, and particularly in Africa, because I think again, the Chinese solar panels, the sales are really surging very fast. They're really asking the questions: what are the role of decentralized system and the centralized system in the future? My impression is that if we look forward, if we really think about energy transition in a strategic way, we'll probably need both. Right, because a rooftop system and this distributed system is very important for rural, particularly rural energy access, make previously impossible communities to be connected or to be lightened. But at the same time, if you think about many African governments' aspiration of industrialization, increasing, mineral processing, all these type of energy-intensive activities, which probably still need some support of grid and stronger, the better grid-connected power supply. So the question is that obviously we see the short-term conflicts because the financing on both pathways are constrained. And also particularly the financing for the decentralized system is even more difficult in terms of considering private finance. And you need to have some blended finance mechanisms from either from philanthropy or from development finance institutes, rather than have complete commercially viable financial model for the massive amount of rural connection project, rural rooftop system projects. And China played a limited role for developing those programs because, Chinese capacities in developing this development aid, this type of programs are far lagged behind than their capacities to develop massive infrastructure projects. And so that's the areas that Chinese actors, that's what I'm advocating in China. Is like, these are the areas that the China should look at it, how to, really pace up their development aid in these areas, because it's not just about selling solar panels and dumping into the rural areas. So you need to talk about maintenance, afterward services, providing trainings, and creating local entrepreneurship to make the system work in the long run, which is absent at the moment, and which Chinese should learn from maybe other bilateral agencies or World Banks and so on. But that kind of learning pathways, we come back to the North-South South-South collaboration, this type of question, that kind of mechanism is still lacking. So that come back to the question is like, what's the role of the host government in Africa to asking for this, to really play a coordinating and a facilitating role to navigating all the necessary resources that needed to really make the rural electricity transformation happening. But at the same time, looking forward to, for example, if you still need to think about large processing for mineral sector, digital centers, and those activities still need grid power support. And you need both, and how to coordinate these activities within very limited financial budget and financial sources. It's a really big challenge, and the smart government will win. And I'm not sure all the governments are capable of doing this. But once the government find a way to lower down the transactional costs of this, for example, blended finance, are the governments, are the countries that can really have both, rather than looking at centralized, decentralized, like a rivalry kind of sectors.
Mm-hmm. Ajikai, one of the issues that we've kind of moved, circled around, but we haven't really kind of dived into it specifically, is the issue of debt. Obviously, at the moment, African, a lot of African countries are facing very significant debt burdens, so I was wondering how this plays out in the electricity sector specifically, and what you see, kind of from this data, whether you see kind of pathways towards lessening the kind of sovereign debt burdens that development projects and climate projects are increasingly kind of adding to the African portfolio?
No, it's a great question. And as mentioned, I think, from the electricity perspective, there's essentially two levels of debt, or two levels of debt that we can look at. So we can look at it from the utility level, and then we can look at it from, the larger state level. So as mentioned a bit earlier, at the utility level, essentially what happens is that, a power project will be built and then it would be sold by usually a state-owned utility. That would be sold to the public. But what we find is a lot of the state-owned utilities are not financially viable, and they're actually running at a loss, and so need quite a lot of government bailouts to essentially continue functioning. And then we look at it at the broader perspective of at a state level perspective, where we see, again, a lot of African governments having competing requirements and just quite heavily indebted. And when we see Chinese investment coming in, it comes in usually at a state level, which is a bit different from, for example, private sector, Chinese state investment, which is a bit different from private sector investment, which we've seen kind of Western financiers go for a bit more, which then does not, how can I say, they both impact, but the private sector investment essentially impacts on the utility level, whereas the Chinese investment impacts on the state level. And so I think it's very important that, there is the recognition that there is a contribution to Africa's debt sustainability challenges by, Chinese financing. But I also think that there needs to be a recognition of the importance of the infrastructure that's coming out of that debt financing, and essentially the impact that infrastructure would have. And I think, even with the approach to financing this infrastructure using debt, I think Wei Shen can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's following a very similar developmental path that China had, to say it focused on developing its infrastructure in order to catalyze its economy. So I think for me, it's a personal view, as much as there's the debt sustainability challenges, I think that, a focus on infrastructure and getting Africa to where it needs to be from an infrastructure perspective, that view needs to be weighed out and balanced against, I think, a very heavy focus on the debt aspects, and less recognition of the impact that critical infrastructure has on economies, and growth of economies, which is a stage that Africa is currently at. So handing back to you, Cobus.
Thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of our first China-Africa Energy Forum. We're very, very grateful to Ajikai, to Wei, to Frangton for joining us. Thank you so much for all of your work. We're delighted to be featuring it. And we would like to invite everyone to check out our China-Africa Energy Tracker. It's very fun to play around with. Like, one really gets quite a deep and detailed kind of like view of the complexity and the different kind of levels of Chinese involvement in the African power sector. We will do more of these. We're planning to roll these conversations out over a variety of topics over the next few months. So please keep checking in on us. You can, for our podcast listeners, this will go out as a podcast as well, and it will remain up on YouTube to rewatch as well, if you missed the live stream. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to Ajikai, to Wei, and to Frangton for joining us, and to all of you for joining us. And we'll see you again soon. Bye bye.
Thank you.